Walk down almost any quiet street in Greenwich Village or Brooklyn Heights, and you will eventually pass a house that has been standing since the early Republic. A narrow red brick front, a steep wooden stoop, a fan light above the door letting in the same light it has let in for 200 years. Most people pass without stopping. They see an old building. They may notice the brickwork or the delicate woodwork around the door and think, elegant, simple, old New York. But look a little more carefully and you will find a second door, set below street level, reached by a short flight of steps that drops beneath the stoop. Same building, two entrances, and between them, an entire world. This is the story of the Federal Row House, the modest, quietly ambitious building that shaped early New York and that encoded, in brick and proportion and threshold, everything the young republic wanted to believe about itself and everything it preferred not to say out loud. Between 1790 and 1835, a single building type quietly took over the streets of Lower Manhattan and the new suburb rising across the East River in Brooklyn Heights. Not a palace, not a church. A narrow red brick row house, 2 or 3 stories tall, a steep pitched roof, a pair of small dormers, and a front door dressed in woodwork of almost surgical delicacy. The Federal-style row house was architecture that had learned to be polite. After the Revolution, the young republic needed a domestic form that matched its self-image, orderly, rational, neither aristocratic nor crude. It found one in a stripped-down reading of the Adam style, the light, elegant classicism Robert Adam had popularized in late Georgian Britain, translated into American brick, adapted to American lot sizes, and reproduced by the hundreds across Manhattan's expanding street grid. What emerged was a building that looked almost modest from the street, yet encoded an entire social philosophy in its proportions. The facade withholds. No projecting bays, no heavy stone ornament, no dramatic roofline, just red brick in Flemish bond, alternating headers and stretchers, the most labor-intensive pattern a mason could produce, and therefore a quiet signal of quality. Below, the front door sits at the top of a narrow stoop, framed by woodwork of such delicacy that the whole composition seems lifted directly from classical ideals of reason and balance. That is almost everything. And that restraint was not poverty, it was ideology made visible in brick. The Federal era in American architecture runs roughly from the end of the Revolutionary War through the 1820s, bracketed at one end by the new republic's need to invent itself and at the other by the rise of Greek revival. In New York, the Federal Row House peaks between about 1805 and 1825, when the city's merchant and artisan classes are expanding rapidly, when new streets are being pushed northward from the colonial core, and when speculative builders are filling block after block with near-identical rows of these narrow brick houses. The Commissioner's Plan of 1811 locked in the 25 by 100-foot lot that made the Federal Row House not just possible, but economically inevitable. Brick dominated for reasons that were practical before they were aesthetic. New York had already burned badly in 1776 when fire swept through the colonial city during the British occupation. By the time the federal building boom began, the preference for masonry construction was less a stylistic choice than a hard lesson absorbed into common practice. What made the Federal Row House different from what came before it was primarily a matter of restraint. Georgian houses carried heavier ornamental ambitions, bolder window surrounds, more elaborate cornices, classical pilasters framing the entry. The Federal style shed most of that weight. It kept the vocabulary of classical order, symmetry, proportion, the fanlight's reference to rationalism, but thinned it almost to abstraction. A Federal doorway does not announce itself the way a Georgian one does. It suggests. This distinction was understood at the time as an architectural equivalent of Republican virtue. No aristocratic display, no inherited grandeur, just a composed and disciplined domestic front for a citizen of the new republic. The typical interior reinforced this logic. Through the front door ran a narrow stair hall along one side of the house, the side hall plan, with a front parlor and a rear parlor behind it. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms per floor. Below, a basement kitchen. The plan was efficient to a degree that bordered on Spartan. Everything communicated sufficiency rather than excess. And yet, sufficiency was a mask. These houses were not built for ordinary working people. They were built for merchants, ship captains, tradesmen, and professionals, people whose incomes placed them well above the laboring classes, even if they fell short of the old Knickerbocker elite. The Federal Row House was a respectable address in a city that was rapidly learning to sort itself by address. The row itself mattered as much as any individual house. Federal row houses were almost never built singly. They went up in short or long rows, speculative projects where a builder would take a stretch of newly platted lots, erect matching fronts, and sell or rent them as a group. Walking along one of these blocks today, the impression is less of individual houses than of a single composed surface, a long horizontal composition in red brick and quiet ornament that speaks of order, repetition, and the rationality of a city building itself at speed. That surface said something both true and false about the city it faced. True. New York in this period was a city of remarkable commercial energy, expanding fast, producing real wealth for a broad tier of its white male population. False. The order encoded in those neat Flemish bond facades rested on foundations that had nothing to do with Republican equality, on enslaved labor still legal in New York until 1827, on domestic servitude that confined women and black workers to basements and attics, and on a commercial economy entangled at every level with Atlantic slavery. The brick was calm. What it covered was not. Every Federal Row house began not with an architect's drawing but with a land deal. A builder, rarely a celebrated name, usually a speculative carpenter or mason with access to merchant capital, would acquire a stretch of newly platted lots on a freshly cut Manhattan street, negotiate credit through informal networks, and begin raising brick walls before the ink on the transaction was fully dry. This was not architecture as art. It was architecture as investment, moving at the speed of a city that could not build fast enough for the people pouring into it. New York in the decades after the Revolution was expanding with a velocity that alarmed and excited in equal measure. The port was booming. Trade with the Caribbean, Europe, and the American interior was making merchants wealthy faster than the city's housing stock could absorb them. Streets that had been fields or scrubland in 1790 were platted, sold, and built upon within a few years. The pressure was not gentle, it was the pressure of a city that understood land as the primary instrument of wealth accumulation, and that treated every unbuilt lot as money left on the table. Into this environment stepped the speculative builder. He was not a romantic figure. He worked from pattern books rather than original designs. Publications circulating through the trades gave him the fanlight templates, the cornice profiles, the proportions he needed. He built in rows because rows were efficient. Shared party walls meant less brick and less labor per unit. Standardized windows, door surrounds, and stair details across 6 or 8 houses at once meant his craftsmen could develop a rhythm. The result looked composed from the street because it was composed not by artistic intention but by the logic of repetition and cost control. The financing that made this possible was informal by later standards. Capital flowed through personal relationships, a merchant with surplus cash extending credit to a builder he knew, a landowner selling lots on installment, a network of handshake agreements that functioned reasonably well in a community where reputation was both currency and collateral. This informality had consequences. Building booms were closely tied to the fortunes of the merchant class. When trade was good, credit flowed and rows went up. When trade contracted, building stopped and half-finished shells could sit for seasons. It also meant that access to this system was tightly bounded by race, gender, and social standing. Women could not easily enter these credit networks. Black New Yorkers, free or otherwise, were almost entirely shut out of the speculative building economy, whether as builders, financiers, or buyers. Skilled tradesmen in early 19th century New York were not cheap. Masons and carpenters commanded wages that reflected both their training and the physical demands of their work. Apprenticeship systems governed entry into the trades, and journeymen moved between builders with considerable freedom. This labor market reality pushed federal row house design toward restraint in a very direct way. The more elaborate the ornament, the more skilled labor hours required, and the higher the cost per unit. The fanlight over the front door looks delicate and refined, but it was also a precisely calculated ornament, complex enough to signal quality, simple enough to reproduce across 8 doors without bankrupting the builder. Every molding profile, every cornice detail was similarly calibrated. Federal elegance and federal economy turned out to be the same thing. Below the skilled trade sat a larger world of laborers who moved the materials, hauling brick from the wharves, digging foundations, mixing mortar, carrying lumber through unfinished stair openings. This labor was less organized, less protected, and less well documented. Immigrants arriving from Ireland and Germany in growing numbers filled many of these roles. Free and recently emancipated black workers also labored in the construction supply chains, in brick yards, in lumber yards, in the physical work of moving material through a city being built on top of itself at speed. Hudson brick, Connecticut brownstone, New England lumber, all of it arriving by water, all of it feeding a building boom the city could not slow down. The Commissioner's Plan of 1811 formalized something that speculative builders had already begun working out on their own. The plan imposed a regular grid of streets on Manhattan above Houston Street, establishing the framework within which every subsequent building would have to operate. But the grid's regularity meant that a builder who had mastered the federal row house on one block could apply the same logic to the next block north and the block after that. The city was not just expanding. It was replicating at speed a tested formula for turning land into shelter and shelter into capital. What the formula produced, taken block by block, was something genuinely new in American urban life. A consistent, walkable street of near-identical domestic fronts, collectively forming a civic texture that felt stable and orderly even when the underlying financial arrangements were anything but. The federal row house block looked like permanence. It was built on credit, speculation, and the labor of people whose names the deeds rarely recorded. What was happening inside these houses, and who was making them run, is a story the architecture was specifically designed not to tell. Walk up to a federal row house from the street and the first thing you encounter is a decision the architect made about you. Not you specifically, but your category. Are you a guest, a family member, a business caller arriving with a card and an appointment? Then you climb the stoop, pass through the fanlight door, and enter the narrow hall that leads to the parlor. Or are you a servant, a tradesperson, a coal merchant, a laundress collecting linens? Then you do not use the stoop at all. You descend. A short flight of steps drops below street level into the areaway, a sunken passage between the stoop's base and the iron fence, and you enter through the basement door, below the parlor floor, into the part of the house that the architecture has decided you belong in. 2 doors, 1 house. The entire social logic of the federal row house compressed into a single threshold decision made before anyone had exchanged a word. The side hall plan that defined the federal row house interior was not an accident of taste or a neutral spatial solution. It was a machine for organizing people. Through the front door ran a narrow entrance hall, positioned along one side of the house's width. This hall was not a room. It was a sequence, a place to receive a caller, to take a coat, to signal by its proportions, and finish that the house beyond was orderly and respectable. Off this hall sat the front parlor, the visible formal world of the household. Behind it the rear parlor, used for dining and the quieter rhythms of daily family life. Everything else was infrastructure. The front parlor carried the weight of the family's public identity. Its fireplace was the best in the house, its windows faced the street, tall and symmetrical, dressed with interior shutters that could be partially closed to modulate light and signal, from outside, a degree of privacy. Furniture was arranged with deliberate attention, chairs positioned for conversation, a center table for books or needlework, surfaces available for the calling cards that governed the rituals of respectable social life in early Republican New York. When visitors arrived, and visiting was a structured, almost ceremonial activity in this period, they were received in this room. Upstairs, the logic continued vertically. 2 bedrooms per floor, off a narrow landing served by the main stair, which rose steeply through the house. There were no back stairs in most federal row houses. The house was too narrow, the lot too constrained, to permit the full service stair apparatus that grander 19th century houses would later install. Everyone used the same stair. But not at the same time and not with the same freedom. Below all of this, below the parlor floor, below street level, was the basement, and the basement was where the actual work of the household happened. The kitchen occupied this level, lit by small windows that looked out into the areaway, close enough to the street to receive coal and wood deliveries without hauling them through the formal hall. Cooking in a federal row house basement meant working over an open hearth or, later in the period, an iron range, in a low-ceilinged room thick with smoke, lit inadequately, heated to extremes in summer and cold in winter when the fire went out at night. The kitchen was not designed for comfort. It was designed to function at a remove from the rooms above it, so that the smells of cooking, the sounds of pots and fire, the physical presence of labor would not penetrate the parlor's composed atmosphere. Adjacent to the kitchen sat storage spaces for coal, wood, and the miscellaneous equipment of household maintenance. A scullery for washing, perhaps a small room for a live-in servant. These spaces were not finished in any aesthetic sense, bare brick or rough plaster, earthen or stone floors, minimal light. They were functional voids, defined entirely by what happened in them rather than by any attempt to make them habitable in the way the parlor was habitable. That distinction between rooms designed to be seen and spaces designed merely to function ran through the entire federal row house like a fault line. Behind the house stretched the rear yard, where the bodily reality of household life was managed and contained. A privy, firewood, ash and refuse, laundry done in iron pots, wet linen strung across lines in all weathers. It was, in this sense, the most honest part of the house. Looked at whole, front stoop, side hall parlor, basement kitchen, rear yard, the federal row house was a spatial argument about who deserved light, air, and a finished surface and who did not. The parlor got tall windows and a detailed mantel. The kitchen got a small areaway window and bare walls. The guest climbed the stoop into a composed and orderly hall. The servant descended into a low-ceilinged room that the building's formal language pretended did not exist. The architecture was not subtle about any of this. It simply presented its hierarchy as natural, as the inevitable shape that a well-ordered household would take, and trusted that no one looking at the fanlight from the street would think to ask what was happening below it. And at the end of the next chapter, what was happening below it will be harder to look away from. In the winter of 1810, a merchant household on a federal row house block in Lower Manhattan would have included, alongside the key, Family itself, at least one or two people whose names do not appear in the deed, whose labor made the house function, and whose legal status existed somewhere on a spectrum that the state of New York had not yet fully resolved. They hauled coal up from the basement before the family woke. They kept the parlor fire burning through the visiting hours. They carried water up 2 flights of steep stairs, emptied chamber pots before dawn, scrubbed the kitchen hearth, and managed the laundry in the rear yard through weather the parlor floor never felt. When the household entertained, they moved through the same rooms that guests occupied, but at different hours, in different directions, and without the expectation that anyone would note their presence. New York in 1810 was not a free state. Slavery had been legal in New York since the colonial period, and while the state had passed a gradual Emancipation Act in 1799, the law's architecture was designed more to manage the transition away from slavery than to end it quickly. Children born to enslaved mothers after July 4, 1799 were technically free, but bound to their mother's enslaver as indentured servants until their mid-20s. Enslaved people born before that date remained legally enslaved until full emancipation arrived in 1827. In practical terms, this meant that through the entire peak period of federal row house construction, roughly 1800 to 1825, Black New Yorkers lived and worked within white households in conditions that range from legal slavery to constrained quasi-freedom, with the line between the two often deliberately blurred by the households that benefited from the ambiguity. The federal row house was built to accommodate this arrangement without acknowledging it. The attic room under the steep roof, small, uninsulated, lit by one of those modest dormer windows that read from the street as charming architectural detail, was frequently where a bound or enslaved domestic worker slept. The basement kitchen, already the least habitable space in the house by design, was both workplace and, in some households, sleeping quarters for live-in servants. The spatial hierarchy that the previous chapter described as a matter of social convention was also, for much of this period, a legal and economic fact. Some of the people living below the parlor floor were there not by choice or employment but by ownership. This history sits uncomfortably with the architecture's self-presentation. The federal row house, with its restrained classical proportions and its rhetoric of republican order, was built by and for people who understood themselves as participants in an experiment in self-governance, citizens of a republic that had just fought a war against hereditary tyranny. The fanlight above the front door quoted the language of reason and enlightenment. Nothing in the exterior acknowledged that the household it fronted might contain people held in bondage, or that the same merchant who walked to his counting house each morning might own the woman who lit his kitchen fire. Manumission records from the New York Manumission Society, founded in 1785 by men who included Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, document hundreds of individual cases of enslaved people in New York during exactly the federal row house period. These records give names, ages, sometimes occupations, sometimes the names of the households where they lived. They are not abstract. They are specific. Women listed as belonging to merchant households in Lower Manhattan. Men bound as indentured apprentices into their late 20s, their labor assigned to tradesmen whose home addresses placed them on blocks of federal row houses in the village and along the east side streets. The records do not describe the attic rooms where these people slept or the basement kitchens where they worked. But the buildings survive. And the proportions of those rooms have not changed. The domestic labor that sustained a federal row house household was overwhelmingly female, whether performed by enslaved women, bound servants, free black workers, or white domestic employees. Heating a house with multiple fireplaces required carrying coal or wood from the basement to each room, managing fires that needed tending several times a day. Water arrived not from a tap but from a pump in the rear yard or purchased from water carriers who moved through the streets, hauled up in buckets to whatever floor needed it, then hauled back down as wastewater. Laundry was a full-day operation involving heated water, lye soap, heavy wet linen, and the rear yard regardless of season. The narrow stairs of the side hall plan, which read in architectural drawings as an elegant spatial solution, were in daily practice something else entirely. A coal scuttle weighing 20 or 30 pounds carried up 2 flights of steep stairs in a stair hall barely 3 feet wide was not an abstraction of domestic inconvenience. It was a physical reality repeated multiple times a day, every day, by people whose labor the house required and whose comfort the house had not been designed to consider. Free Black New Yorkers, those who had completed indentures, purchased their freedom, or been born free, also worked in these households in significant numbers. The city's free Black community was growing through this period, but access to property ownership, to skilled trades, to the credit networks that built and financed federal row houses remained largely closed to them. Working inside the houses as domestic employees was one of the few economic roles the city reliably made available. What the federal row house did with all of this labor was absorb it and contain it. The basement kitchen kept cooking smells from the parlor. The attic room kept the servants' sleeping presence from the family's floor. The areaway kept the coal delivery from the front stoop. The rear yard kept the laundry from the street. The architecture was not indifferent to this labor. It was organized around it, managing it, containing it, and ensuring that its presence registered as little as possible in the rooms that mattered. One floor above, the parlor was running its own performance, and its own concealment, a different kind, and one that went all the way to the Atlantic. On a Tuesday afternoon in 1818, a merchant's wife in a federal row house on Lower Broadway received callers in her front parlor between the hours of 2 and 4. This was not a social event in the casual sense. It was a performance, governed by rules as precise as any commercial transaction her husband conducted on the docks. Callers arrived, left cards if the mistress was unavailable, were admitted in order of social standing if she was, and took seats in chairs arranged specifically for conversation that communicated intimacy while maintaining distance. The fire burned at the correct temperature. The mantelpiece held the correct objects. Everything in the room was doing work. The same kind of invisible discipline work that the basement kitchen was doing below, except that this work was called refinement rather than labor, and the people performing it were called respectable rather than servants. The federal parlor was the household's public face, and like all public faces, it was constructed with care. Its function was not simply comfort, it was argument. A sustained visual claim about the kind of people who lived here, the kind of order they represented, and the kind of city New York was becoming. In a period when the Republic was still working out what its social hierarchies would look like without the formal structures of aristocracy, the parlor was one of the primary places where those hierarchies were negotiated, displayed, and reproduced. Who you received, how you received them, what your mantelpiece said about your taste, what your curtain said about your income, all of it was legible to anyone who entered, and everyone who entered was reading. The merchant who owned the house on Lower Broadway had made his money through trade, through shipping, through importing goods from the Caribbean or Europe, through the complex web of commercial credit and commodity exchange that made New York the dominant Atlantic port of the early 19th century. He understood himself as a self-made man, and the federal row house was the architectural expression of that self-understanding. Not a mansion, not a freestanding villa behind iron gates, but a house that was part of a row, its elegance measured and republican rather than ostentatious or hereditary. He had worked for this house. The house said so. What the house did not say, what nothing in its composed Flemish bond facade or its carefully arranged parlor acknowledged, was where the money that built it had actually come from. New York's merchant economy in the federal period was not separable from Atlantic slavery. The port handled cotton from southern plantations worked by enslaved people. It financed sugar from Caribbean colonies whose labor forces lived and died in conditions of extreme brutality. It insured slave ships. It extended credit to southern planters whose collateral was the bodies of the people they owned. The counting houses that lined the waterfront below the federal row house neighborhoods were active participants in the financial infrastructure that made slavery profitable and therefore persistent. This is not a guilt by association argument. It is a structural one. The parlor that received callers on Tuesday afternoons, the mantelpiece that displayed tasteful objects, these were not separate from that economy. They were its domestic product. The house was what Atlantic commerce looked like when it came home in the evening, changed its coat, and arranged itself for company. The parlor performed other kinds of concealment besides the economic: calling hours, card leaving, the careful gradations of who was admitted to the front parlor versus who was directed to the rear, who was offered tea versus who was kept standing in the hall. These were mechanisms of social sorting that operated continuously and were understood by everyone who participated in them. The federal row house parlor was not a democratic space. It was a carefully managed room where the Republic's rhetoric about equality was quietly set aside in favor of the Republic's actual social arrangements. Women managed most of this. The mistress of a federal row house household was responsible not just for receiving callers but for the entire social economy of the household's public life, maintaining relationships, managing the gradations of obligation and invitation, ensuring that the parlor's surfaces and arrangements communicated the right messages at all times. This work was skilled, exhausting, and entirely unpaid, not counted as labor in any economic sense, because it was performed by a wife rather than an employee, and because it happened in a parlor rather than a kitchen. The distinction between the mistress managing the parlor's social performance and the servant managing the kitchen's physical labor was real, in terms of status and legal standing, but both were forms of work that the household required and that the house itself had been designed to absorb without acknowledgement. The Bowery, a few blocks east of Broadway's Federal Rows, illustrates what happened when the parlor's social argument began to lose its audience. In the 1810s and 1820s, the Bowery was solidly middle class. Tidy federal row houses, respectable tradesmen, the kind of neighborhood whose residents understood themselves as exactly the people these houses were built for. By the 1840s and 1850s, it was something else entirely. Theaters, saloons, working-class boarding houses, the federal front still standing but stripped of the social context that had made them legible as respectability. The houses had not changed. The argument they made had simply stopped working, because the people making it had moved uptown, and the people who replaced them had different arguments to make and different rooms to make them in. What persisted, below the performance, was the house itself, the brick party walls, the steep stair, the basement kitchen still dark and smoky, the rear yard still holding the evidence of everything the parlor had preferred not to discuss. The parlor told a story about Republican virtue and commercial respectability and the orderly progress of a young city finding its form. The rest of the house told a different story, less composed and considerably more honest, about what it actually took to make a federal row house function in early 19th century New York. The federal row house did not fall out of fashion gradually. It was overtaken first by taste, then by economics, then by the sheer pressure of a city that had decided small and restrained were no longer sufficient descriptions of what it wanted to be. Greek revival arrived in New York in the 1820s and moved through the city's residential streets with the confidence of something that knew it had already won. Where federal was delicate, Greek revival was monumental, Heavy stone stoops, temple front doorways with full pilasters and thick entablatures, facades that sat on the street with a solidity that made federal row houses look, by comparison, almost tentative. Italianate brownstone followed in the 1840s and 1850s with something still grander: deeper cornices, bracketed hoods, entire blocks turned into continuous walls of serious, expensive intention. The same merchant class that had built federal rows now wanted something that communicated not just respectability but permanence, not a citizen's house but something closer to an institution. Federal row houses did not disappear overnight. They were simply outpaced, left behind as the city's center of gravity moved steadily northward. As prosperous families followed new development uptown, the federal row house blocks of Lower Manhattan began a long process of downward social transition, from merchant households to boarding houses, from boarding houses to multifamily tenements, from respectable addresses to something the new guidebooks preferred not to linger on. The 25 by 100-foot lot, which had made the federal row house an efficient and logical unit in 1810, now revealed a darker potential. As landlords subdivided rooms, added rear extensions, and filled yards with secondary structures, the same lot dimensions that had once housed a single merchant family began housing a dozen or more people in conditions that reformers documented with growing alarm. The lot had not changed. The economic pressure on it had. One housing reformer in the 1850s, surveying tenement conditions in Lower Manhattan, observed that the standard New York building lot was perhaps the single greatest structural cause of urban overcrowding, an observation that landed with particular irony on the federal row house blocks where that lot size had once seemed the foundation of orderly domestic life. By the late 19th century, elevated railways brought noise and shadow to streets that had once been quiet residential blocks. Ground floors were torn open for shops, stoops were rebuilt in heavier styles or removed entirely for commercial access. Many houses disappeared altogether, demolished for warehouse construction, for institutional buildings, for the relentless expansion of a commercial city that had stopped seeing small federal row houses as assets. Urban renewal in the mid-20th century finished what commercial redevelopment had begun. Entire blocks of early 19th century fabric were cleared for modernist housing projects, highway approaches, and institutional campuses. By the time New York's preservation movement began systematically documenting what remained, the Federal Row House project of the 1980s, surveying Lower Manhattan block by block, the count had fallen to approximately 330 surviving examples below 20th Street. 330 houses, out of the thousands that had once defined the texture of the early city. What remained was what accident and landmarking had managed to protect, scattered across Greenwich Village, Tribeca, and the South Village like evidence of something the city had very nearly decided to forget entirely. The approximately 330 federal row houses that remained in Lower Manhattan by the late 20th century survived not because the city chose to protect them, but because a series of accidents, campaigns, and close calls left them standing when everything around them was coming down. Greenwich Village's preservation movement, energized in the early 1960s by neighborhood activists who had watched demolition consume federal-era fabric across Lower Manhattan, secured historic district status for large swaths of the village, effectively freezing the pressure that had consumed so much of what came before. Brooklyn Heights followed, a similar path becoming New York's first designated historic district in 1965. What these campaigns saved, they also transformed. The act of preservation is never neutral. It changes what a building means, who wants it, and what it costs. Today, a surviving federal row house in Greenwich Village or Brooklyn Heights is not a modest merchant's dwelling. It is a rare object in one of the world's most expensive real estate markets, and it is marketed accordingly. Listings describe original federal mantels, period fan lights, authenticated Flemish bond brickwork, details that were once simply the standard features of a speculative builder's product, reproduced across dozens of identical houses on the same block, now repositioned as irreplaceable individual characteristics that justify prices no early 19th century merchant could have imagined. The scarcity that preservation created became the foundation of a luxury brand. Heritage and exclusivity turned out to be the same argument. This transformation carries a specific irony. The federal row house was built as a vehicle for a particular kind of aspiration, the merchant class fantasy of orderly Republican respectability, modest enough not to seem aristocratic, substantial enough to signal arrival. It has become, in its surviving form, something much closer to what it originally claimed not to be. A rare, expensive, status-conferring object available only to those with access to significant capital. The fanlight that once signaled sober Republican virtue now signals something more straightforward. It signals money. The preservation debates that surround these buildings today are real and unresolved. Critics of landmark protection argue that freezing low-rise historic districts in some of the city's most desirable neighborhoods directly constrains housing supply, keeping prices high and displacing lower-income residents as effectively as any demolition campaign. Defenders argue that the rarity and cultural value of surviving federal row houses and the broader historic districts that give them context justify protection that the market alone would never provide. Both arguments are serious. Neither fully confronts the history embedded in the buildings themselves. That history is what recent scholarship and community activism have begun to bring back into view. The comfortable narrative of federal row houses as embodiments of early American civic virtue, quiet, orderly, authentically historical, has been complicated by the work of historians documenting New York's slavery period, by preservation organizations beginning to acknowledge the bound and enslaved people who lived and worked within these walls, and by a broader reckoning with whose stories get told when a building is declared historically significant. The fanlight above the front door still lets in light the same way it did in 1815. The Flemish bond brick still holds. The steep stair still rises through the narrow hall. But the house records more than its owners ever intended it to. The spatial hierarchy of its floors, the smallness of its attic rooms, the darkness of its basement kitchen, the two doors that sorted people before they had spoken a word. What survives is not just architecture, it is evidence. And evidence, unlike a real estate listing, does not get to choose what it remembers.